Senator Siewert.
To speak about the continuing the fallout from the oil spill in the Timor Sea, the PTTEP and Montara spill, and the need for ongoing improvement in our oil and gas regulations, and concerns I have around the granting of further leases before the improvements that have been promised by government to our regulations have been made. In November last year, the government released the Commission of Inquiry report into the Montara oil spill of the year before. They also released the government response to the Commission of Inquiry. Many of the recommendations the government has picked up and made a number of commitments. One of those was that they would ensure that an independent review of PTTEP Australasia's action plan about how they would improve their operations and management of their operations in Australian waters, and the government said that they would commission an independent review of that action plan. And this was in response to the recommendation of the Commission of Inquiry report that, in fact, PTTEP should be forced to show cause about why their leases shouldn't be resumed by the government. The government undertook to release that independent review within 7 days of receiving that review, and they anticipated that would be before the end of the year and the early new year. In fact, the government released its response, released the review, as I understand it, within 7 days of them having received it, just at the end of last Friday. The report of the independent review is quite a comprehensive document. It makes some very strong statements on the significant and sweeping changes in governance and oilfield practice that PTTEP needs to make to reach the kind of safety and risk management standards that the community expects if it is to operate in Australian waters. In doing so, it has reinforced the findings of the Montara Commission of Inquiry, which found conclusively that the widespread and systematic shortcomings in PTTEP's governance and procedures were a direct cause of the Montara disaster. The report suggests that if PTTEP complies precisely with the Montara Action Plan, then it can meet industry best practice standards in all of its Australian and Australasian operations. But that is a big if, and the report was really clear on that. The report concludes that the success of this program of cultural and practice change will depend entirely on the quality of its execution, and it bolded that statement in its report. The government, in response to this, said that they would put in place an 18-month monitoring plan to ensure that the plan was being implemented. And they said that as I understand it, they're saying that that monitoring plan will be comprehensive. And this monitoring plan is critical, that it's critical it's done properly, and it's critical that it's intensive and comprehensive. We need to that report needs any report or the reporting from that monitoring plan, we believe, needs to be made publicly available. And if PTTEP is not sticking to its action plan, the government should not be waiting 18 months to take any action necessary to resume those leases. I continue to have reservations about PTT being allowed to continue to operate in Australian waters, given the findings of the Montara inquiry. We will continue to pursue this issue. We will continue to pursue the monitoring plan, and in fact, I will be putting to government that they release the monitoring plan needs to be done at least once a month, and those monitoring plans are in fact released through Parliament and tabled in Parliament, so that the public can be absolutely assured that this company is meeting every requirement of its action plan. We note that the independent review concludes that until the action plan is completed and fully implemented, questions remain about whether PTT will be effective in meeting industry standards for good governance and good oilfield practice. This means it has to complete the action plan before it is operating at the kind of standard the Australian community rightfully expects for it to be able to tap our shared oil and gas resources. This is why the report stresses that ongoing government oversight will be critical to ensure PTTEP's compliance with the action plan. We believe that until PTT has fully complied with and completed the action plan and very clearly demonstrated it has achieved industry best practice in governance and oilfield practice, it should not be granted any additional licences to establish any new operations in Australian waters. What this independent review says is that PTTEP isn't there yet. It has to implement its management plan, its action plan. In other words, it hasn't yet met industry best practice. It hasn't demonstrated it can meet that. It has now demonstrated it can write an action plan, but not that it's been implemented yet. So we question why this government thinks it would be acceptable to grant this company more licences in Australian waters when it is yet to demonstrate it can meet industry best practice. We note in the report, in the independent review report that was released last Friday, we note that it took PTT 2 goes to develop an appropriate action plan. Its first action plan focused entirely on technical issues without addressing the many systematic and governance issues that led directly to the Montara disaster, was clearly pointed out in the review. And we are concerned that, again, that highlights the fact that PTTEP needs to demonstrate it can do both improve its technical performance and its governance performance in a sustained manner. We note that PTT will be required to sign a binding agreement to implement the action plan if it is not asked to show cause as to why it shouldn't have its leases taken off it, and that to enable it to continue in Australian waters. We believe that the Minister should be able to issue a show cause notice at any time if this company fails to meet its milestones in its action plan. The independent review also makes a number of important recommendations concerning the offshore petroleum industry as a whole. One message that came through to me during the entire Montara disaster and the subsequent inquiry was that PTTEP was unlikely to be the only offshore operator who were cutting corners on good governance, on environmental risk and worker safety, and that there have been a number of near misses in the past, and that stronger regulation to achieve better governance and oilfield practices was required right across the industry, and I note this has been acknowledged by government. To this end, we will continue to pursue this better regulatory practice and to ensure that we do put in place a world-class regulatory regime to ensure that all companies operating off our shores comply with the highest standards of safety and risk management. We believe that there's a significant cultural change required across the offshore oil and gas industry, and to ensure that the safety of our workers and the protection of our precious environment. Which then brings me to the issues of the granting of new licences that were made during January. Licences that were granted to BP. BP, the company that was responsible for the disastrous oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico from the Deepwater Horizon well. An incident that is eerily the same as the Montara disaster. This company has been granted leases, 4 leases in the frontier area in the Ceduna sub-basin, which is within the Great Australian Bight off the South Australian coast. It's been granted leases over 24,000 kilometres of the Great Australian Bight. It's in deep water that's 3 times deeper than the Deepwater Horizon well, 4,500 metres. No matter what safety measures are put in place, deep sea drilling is incredibly risky. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail later and provide some findings of the inquiry into that particular disaster. This area are key feeding, breeding and migratory sites for a number of threatened species. It also happens to cover a large area of the Great Australian Bight Marine Park. These are important areas for the southern right whale, the humpback whale, the great white shark and the southern bluefin tuna, to mention but a few. And the Minister says It's okay, we've put some extra conditions on BP. But BP have not clearly demonstrated that they have addressed the very significant issues that were raised by that gigantic disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. When you look at the findings of the National Commission on the Deepwater Horizon Oil Spill and Offshore Drilling report, it makes very scary reading. And I will say again, many of the findings and recommendations of the US inquiry mirror many of the findings of the Montara inquiry. This is a conclusion on Chapter 4 of the very extensive Commission of Inquiry findings on the Deepwater Horizon spill. It is and this is in relation to deepwater drilling. It says it's an inherently risky business given the enormous pressures and geologic uncertainties present in the formations where oil and gas are found, thousands of feet below the ocean floor. Notwithstanding these inherent risks, the accident of April the 20th was avoidable. It resulted from clear mistakes made in the first instance by BP, Halliburton, and as an aside, Halliburton does, as I understand it, around 50% of the well cementing of wells in Australia, so they are a significant player in our industry here in Australia, and Transocean. And by government officials who are relying too much on industry's assertion of the safety of their operations, failure to create a program of regulatory oversight that would have properly minimised the risks of deep well drilling. It is now clear that both industry and government need to reassess and change business practices to minimise the risks of such drilling. William Riley, who was the chair of that inquiry, made also, I think, a number of very significant comments, but one of his comments was, to my shock, it quickly became clear that while the industry has devoted billions to the technologies required for deep water drilling, it had devoted essentially nothing to creating a plan B, to dealing with the utterly foreseeable consequences of a major spill. Neither had the government. Mr Riley has also been quoted on a number of occasions outlining his concerns outlining his concerns about what happened in the lead-up to that spill. He's also quoted as saying that they have uncovered a culture of complacency, cost-cutting and systematic failures, and companies were unprepared to deal with accidents and their consequences. The report, as I said, outlines the systematic failures that occurred by not only industry but government. Those failings need to be addressed. The failings by BP need to be addressed. Now, where has it been demonstrated to the Australian community, in fact the world community, because this company is an international company, where has it been demonstrated that this company has addressed the major failings that have been identified in its operations in the Gulf of Mexico? We have to bear in mind, as I said, that these new wells in Australian waters will be 3 times the depth of that well in the Gulf of Mexico. The ministers put some additional conditions on the company, but we are yet to see how they are overcoming these systematic failures. At least PTTEP has been required to develop a comprehensive action plan that the government is going to be monitoring for an 18-month period of time to ensure that it can manage its existing operations. Here we have a company that has, through its actions, its systematic failures, have led to the biggest oil spill with outrageous, disastrous consequences socially, taking lives. Social impacts, its economic and environmental impacts are untold. That company has been granted leases in our waters before they have been required to meet the level of industry to demonstrate they can meet the industry's standards, the same way that PTTEP has been required to now demonstrate they can meet those standards. And they will be monitored for the next 18 months. BP hasn't done that. Nor do we have the government's promised amendments to oil and gas regulation. We do not have in place the single regulator yet, the single national regulator yet. And at the same time, in fact, we have the West Australian government saying it won't sign up to it. It doesn't support it. So how can we be granting a company that has not yet demonstrated it can manage its operations in deep water, and yet it's been given 4 leases in Australian waters? That is not adequate management of our oil and gas industry. It is not industry best practice, and we expect better from this government in protecting our marine environment in Australia.
Your time has expired.